This video is about blasphemous intrusive thoughts. This is something that a lot of people may struggle with. It's something I struggle with a lot, especially when I was even at a very young age. And I hope the stuff I talk about in this video can be helpful because I know this can be a very frustrating issue. So basically, for some background, what is exactly this issue? Blasphemous intrusive thoughts are basically offensive thoughts about God that seem to invade one's mind. So, and related to this, those thoughts can lead to great frustration and distress. So, someone may just be like trying to pray or trying to read their Bible or even just like walking in the midst of their day, walking to class or something, and they experience these offensive thoughts, and they're frustrated. They don't want those thoughts to be there. They can even be afraid. They don't want to offend God with these thoughts, and this again can cause great frustration and distress. And again, I can relate firsthand because I used to struggle with this a lot. And it often is connected to some kind of compulsion. So basically, the compulsion is just like the repeated patterned behavior that someone uses to try to deal with the discomfort caused by the intrusive thoughts. So, for example, I mentioned compulsively denying those thoughts out loud. This is something I used to do. So, like when I experienced the thoughts, I would like basically be saying, I don't mean those thoughts, I don't mean those thoughts over and over and over again. And that was like kind of a way of both like trying to it's interesting because it's like you don't want to sit with the thoughts for two reasons. You're afraid to offend God, but you're also afraid of the thoughts themselves. Like maybe if you sit with the thought, you're afraid that like, do I actually mean those thoughts if I don't compulsively argue with them? So there can be a lot of anxiety with that. And then another one is anxiously asking God for mercy. So like if someone gets these thoughts and their response is like to ask God for mercy over and over and over and over again to try to deal with the anxiety, then that can become a kind of compulsion connected to this issue. And I don't have every notebook that I've ever had in my life. But I think it is really cool. Like I'm like literally thankful to God that I have this still. I'm not sure when I wrote this, but it's possible that it was before I was even 10 years old. This is like a notebook that I wrote like various devotional related stuff in. And if you read this, if you are feeling hurt, the Heavenly Father knows that I don't mean to think about those other negative things or really mean them. The Heavenly Father loves me and I love the Heavenly Father, so I don't need to worry. Why do I find this so interesting? At least two reasons. One, it is just very interesting for me to look back again. This is at a very early age and just see like, yeah, this is something I was generally struggling with, and I literally had physical proof at a young age before I wouldn't know how to really think about this issue. That I clearly have like a sign that I was struggling with this. But just another thing, I think I really, even though I don't think I was like very mature in the understanding of the significance of that middle part, when I say that God knows I don't mean to think about those other negative things or really mean them, I think this principle is actually extremely helpful. So what I have here is a circle of obsession, anxiety, compulsion, and momentary reassurance. And this, I put it in a circle because this is pretty much a spiraling process. Someone experiences the obsession. The obsession is just, in this case, it's the experience of the intrusive thoughts. These intrusive thoughts, they lead to anxiety. The anxiety, as I mentioned, the compulsion is basically the patterned behavioral way of responding to the anxiety, or it can be like a mental compulsion. Like if I'm arguing with a thought in my own head, it can also be a mental compulsion. But it's basically an attempt to alleviate that anxiety by like repeating some kind of behavior. And then there is some momentary reassurance. The problem is that insofar as this circle is stayed in, the person just keeps spiraling because then another thought comes. Then there's more anxiety. Now you have another compulsion, another reassurance, another thought comes, and you just keep spiraling and you're not really making much progress. You get the momentary reassurance here and here, but what do you do when the next thought comes up? You just basically, people can make themselves dependent, it seems like, on their compulsions to sit with their anxiety, and then they just get stuck in a circle. So because of this because of this problematic spiraling, I think there is a very important principle to see here of breaking this. I took it and I basically cut the circle in half. And why is this important? Because like I'm saying, if this is a spiraling circle, then insofar as one follows the exact same circle over and over and over again, aren't you just staying in the circle? What I have here is cutting off the compulsion and the momentary reassurance that it gives you, which can be scary, but there's a reason for it. The reason basically is, again, you're trying to break the cycle, but you are trying to be able to sit with your anxiety without engaging in some kind of compulsion, insofar as that compulsion just makes you keep staying in the cycle. I have here omniscience and grace. Why is this important? Well, God is omniscient and knows all things, everything, everything. And so this is key. This is, and like you could see right here, this means he knows your struggle with intrusive thoughts and don't actually mean those thoughts. Now, why is that important? Because God can distinguish between the presence of a thought and the intent of a thought. So it is true that there can be sins that are not behavioral specifically. So like if like hate is not a necessarily a behavioral sin, but there's a difference between so like clearly there's a difference between somebody experiencing an intrusive thought about like harming someone versus somebody literally harboring hatred in their heart versus someone. That's obviously a distinction. And similarly, there is a distinction between someone in the hardness of their heart willingly blaspheming God versus somebody experiencing an intrusive thought that they don't agree with, that they don't intend, and God knows they don't intend that. So I write here, if this is true, wouldn't a compulsion be a means of taking matters into your own hands? So what do I mean? You have this circle, and I mentioned insofar as you're just spiraling in the circle of you panic about the intrusive thoughts, you have some kind of compulsion, the anxiety momentarily goes down, but then another intrusive thought comes in. You don't want to stay in this kind of obsessive anxious circle. What I'm saying is there seems to be importance in breaking the cycle, but you can actually seemingly break it on a coherent basis, which is trust in God's omniscience. So what I'm basically saying is it's almost like there can be a pressure to engage in a compulsion, engage in some kind of argumentation, engage in some kind of behavior to try to make the anxiety about those thoughts go away as a means of like you almost feel like you have to reteach God that you don't mean those thoughts. Like it's like you have to educate him that you don't mean those thoughts genuinely, as if he's not already aware, as if he doesn't see your struggle, as if he is not like the whole cycle. This is why I say it's like taking matters into your own hands. You have the circle, and insofar as you respond to the anxiety, because anxiety can be a real issue in life, but insofar as you respond to it not by trusting in God, but by engaging in compulsion, like trying to reiterate to God over and over and over again that you don't mean those thoughts as if he doesn't already know that, you stay in a spiraling cycle and you act as if God is not intelligent enough to distinguish between the presence of a thought versus the intent of a thought. So this is important because you don't want to stay in the cycle. But there's a real basis then upon which it can be broken in the sense that instead of engaging in a compulsion, you can trust in the omniscience and grace of God because he's a gracious God, and he also again knows the struggle. He knows you don't actually mean those thoughts, and therefore it's not like you need to engage in some kind of compulsion to re-alert him to that fact over and over and over and and just stay in this circle. But insofar as you understand that point, do you see why it's important? The circle can be broken. Now you just have the obsession and the anxiety, but because you're doing that, all of a sudden when you're training yourself to be able to sit with the anxiety without resorting to your compulsion and instead trusting in God in the midst of your anxiety. So I have an important text here. I think this is a helpful text on this principle that God is so gracious and God is omniscient. He knows the struggles we experience, and in this case, God again can distinguish the frustrated, annoyed, someone who's struggling with blasphemous, intrusive thoughts versus someone who is going out of their way in their hard-hearted rejection of him to say and intentionally blaspheme him. So again, back to the circle that is cut in half. The principle that I'm basically getting you to see is that it seems that this is a helpful way of breaking the cycle. You eliminate the compulsion coherently. It's not like this is grounded in absolutely nothing. You understand, like, okay, it seems like people understand there does seem to be a general aspect in which it makes sense that like when somebody obsessively tries to not have a thought, it's almost like those thoughts just become more present. Because don't think about a red shoe and then all of a sudden you think about a red shoe, because if you are thinking of not thinking about a red shoe, it literally requires you to think about a red shoe. So the solution to changing the direction of your thought is not a hyper engaging with not having the thought itself, if that makes sense. Like to some level, I hope you can see what I mean by that. So if that is the case and you can understand that, then your compulsion of basically trying to force out the mere presence of the thought becomes like a kind of way of engaging with the thought of it in of itself. And insofar as one is doing that, instead of sitting with their anxiety and trusting in the omniscience and grace of God, it seems like they just keep spiraling. So what I'm trying to get you to see is that if you're in a circle like this, it is crucially important that one steps outside of the circle, but cool enough, the way that the circle could be stepped out on is this not a very basic principle, trusting in God? Like it makes sense because God is gracious and God is omniscient. So I come back to a personal testimony. I found that the best way for me to stop struggling with blasphemous intrusive thoughts was not to obsess over not having the presence of those thoughts themselves, but instead to basically adopt a more dismissive strategy where I was like, man, what is such nonsense? I don't mean those thoughts, and God knows that I don't mean those thoughts, so I'm not even going to entertain this nonsense. That word entertain is very important because you just imagine, like, you view the intrusive thoughts as like a bully who is excited whenever you respond to them like with active interaction, and if you just shun them and like I'm not gonna pay attention to that, that is like a way of disempowering that. So similarly with this issue, if you don't want to just keep paying those thoughts in of themselves so much attention by engaging in compulsion, you're just basically, I don't mean that. I'm not engaging with that trash. God knows I don't mean that. I'm not going to sit my life anxiously spiraling about this issue because I'm going to trust in God instead. And I know I don't mean those thoughts, and God knows I don't mean those thoughts. So it's an important principle. And then this is, again, basically the key point I'm trying to get at. The circle can be broken, it could be stepped outside of, but it can be stepped outside of on a coherent basis, which is really cool. Trusting in God, which again, ironically, happens to be a core tenet of walking with God. So I hope you see how actually cool this point is. If this is true, it seems to be that there is some extent to which this is a very frustrating trial, and like I said, I can relate to it. It's very, I know it could be saddening. It's annoying, but it can actually be, in a sense, like a means of trusting in God, if that, to some extent, in the sense that like this is an annoying burden. God knows your weakness, but now look at it like you have an opportunity to not obsessively engage in a spiraling process. Instead, step back. You see the circle. You see the circle. You've been struggling in the circle for so long. You take a step back and you're like, when these thoughts arise, they make me anxious. They make me frustrated. I don't want these thoughts. So what do I usually do? I usually sit there and argue with them. I usually try to say out loud that I don't mean those thoughts. I basically engage with the thoughts. I basically pay them attention because I want them to go away. Which is that you should be able to hear in that statement, that with a thought that doesn't really make much sense. You don't, is that how you, like, no, like that you redirect your attention to something else. You don't obsessively fear, and you don't excessively engage with the thought in of itself. So rather than just engaging in the circle, you take a step back, cut the circle, trust in the grace of God, trust in the God who knows all things, and then this is just a better way of dealing with this rather than just engaging in this anxious spiraling circle over and over again. So I hope that point is understandable. This is, again, something I can relate to a lot, I understand it can be very difficult to stop engaging in the compulsion, but it is at least helpful to see that it is, insofar as you stay with the compulsion, you're in a circle, and insofar as you are stepping back from the circle, and you instead trust God, that is a far more coherent way to deal with the actual problem than engaging with the thought in of itself and just paying those thoughts attention in themselves. So remember, God can distinguish between the presence of a thought and the intent of a thought. He is a gracious God who understands the weakness of our minds. Focus on Him, focus on good things rather than obsessively entertaining and engaging with the bad thoughts themselves. And I hope you basically understand what I mean by that point of stepping back from the circle. And yeah, so I hope what I said in this video is helpful. And if you enjoy, please make sure to leave a like. And thanks for watching.